wide-ranging conversation, we cover potential paths to closing the income inequality gap, how to manage one's personal psychology, his perspective on value investing, and tackling climate change. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Chamath Palihapitiya. Chamath, I don't know where to start this conversation. We're going to talk about 50 different things. I've been looking forward to this for a while. Maybe I'll start somewhere completely non-traditional that I don't see you get asked too much about on these podcasts, which is the topic of personal finance. We'll definitely talk about the categories of your investing and capital markets and the future and all these great topics as well. But maybe we'll begin very small with just individual personal finance. The reason I'm interested in your opinion here is what you've had to say about student debt and the really interesting story about $27,000 of debt that you once had, which I think was a part of your early motivations and thinking about risk. Maybe tell that personal story and then talk a little bit about how you think about personal finance as a topic.
Maybe I'll go back even a few years earlier, but when I was 14 years old, my first job was at Burger King. I cleaned the toilets and mopped the floors. And the greatest part about that, I remember how much I made, $4.55 an hour. But the greatest thing about that job was the manager at the Burger King had one of those university varsity jackets. He had gone to University of Waterloo, which is ultimately where I ended up going. And what I saw up front was there's no guarantee of success by going to school. I don't mean to be pejorative, but he's a very good guy and he was really kind to me. But I don't think anybody ever thought of you would go to university and end up necessarily managing a Burger King unless you wanted to. So I worked there, and then there was these riots in Los Angeles related to the Rodney King trial. And in response to that, the government of Ontario created a sponsorship program for minority kids who were growing up on welfare. And so I applied to that. I was accepted, which meant that I could go and get a job at any company I wanted, subsidized by the Ontario government. And most of these kids would go and work at Sears or Zellers. And instead, I took all of my dad's rejection letters because he had been applying for jobs. My dad, unfortunately, didn't get onto a good professional cadence in North America. And I got a job at a company called Newbridge Networks, which was run by this entrepreneur, billionaire guy named Terry Matthews. And I went there and I was making $10 an hour. My introduction to personal finance was understanding our rent, $350 a month, my parents' bills, because I would go marketing with my mom and we didn't have a car. So I knew exactly how much cars cost because I would walk by the used car lots. I knew exactly how much all the groceries cost. I knew how much my mom and I would spend on groceries every week. I knew how much the milk was. I knew that once a year, the cheesecake at Loblaws would get discounted as a special from $6.99 to $4.99, and we could buy one. And these are the memories that I have. And so I grew up very aware of personal finance, how to balance a checkbook and how to pay for bills and how to think about budgeting and what you needed to do when you didn't have enough money. And bus passes were $32 a month in Ottawa and $16 for kids. For my parents and myself, it was $100 and some odd dollars. And that was the first $100 some odd dollars every month of my paycheck. And then I learned how to side hustle. I ran a little casino during lunch hours, 25 cents to $1. And I was the house. And because I went to a very good high school. And so these kids had a lot of money. They lived in these very nice areas of Ottawa. So I ran this casino and I would probably make $50 to $100 a week. And then when I wasn't working at Burger King, a friend of mine and I would go to the charity casinos all around Ottawa. And we would play blackjack and I learned how to count cards. And I would take that 100 and I could probably spin it up to 150. So all of a sudden I had a couple $1,000s. Then I took the couple $1,000s and then I went to the casino in Montreal and I lost it all. And I had to come back and start all over again. So that was the cycle. So then in university, that was the first time though I ran into debt because despite my ability to give money to my parents and had a little bit of money to do all these things in the school casino that I ran, it wasn't still enough to pay for school, and even in a country that had subsidized education. I was collecting debt $5,000 to $7,000 a year, and by the time I had graduated, I had almost $30,000 of debt. And my first job was as a derivatives trader. It was right at the peak of the bubble, and I was investing a lot in the sense that I would make these picks for my bosses, and they were making a lot of money. It was an incredibly transformational moment. My boss, Mike Fisher, who just retired this year, but at the Bank of Montreal, he said to me one day, he's like, Sherman, that was my nickname. He's like, Sherman, how much do you owe in student loans? And I was like, oh, Fish, I owe like $27,000. I was picking some pretty deep tech stocks for him. And at the time, there's a company, I think it was PMC Sierra and JDS Uniphase, like these chip companies. I had picked a couple and Mike had done really well. And he wrote me a check and he said, I'm going to pay off your debt if you go right now downstairs, pay it off. And I was shocked. And I went downstairs and I paid it off. And it changed my life because all of a sudden I had capital. Because at the end of the month, I was not necessarily breaking even. Even through all of that, after I graduated, probably half my paycheck went back to my parents, paying for their house, paying for bills, paying for my sisters. That was sort of my whole life until I had finally gotten a little liquidity at Facebook. That's all I'd ever known. But that one thing all of a sudden gave me $1,000 or $2,000 of free cash flow a month. I could accumulate some savings. I could make some investments. So I was learning the hard way. But to be honest with you, what it really taught me is that personal finance is not taught. Nobody knows how to get ahead, that being poor is a systemic condition in North America. It is a disease that's equivalent to diabetes and heart disease or depression or any other kind of mental illness, except that it's structural and institutionalized. It's not something that's wrong with your physiology. Poverty is just something that's conditioned into people in the way that society works in a Western.
What do you think are the